What's up? I am David Long. How y'all doing today? I hope you're doing well. I got something a little bit different for you today. It's kind of an interview/reaction video. Let me explain. About 8 months ago, when I was finishing up part 2 and 3 of my What You Talking About Wilbur series, I started working on part 4, which is about Wilbur's relationship with science. And so I was hitting up Frank Visser, asking him to send me some video, answering some questions. And he did. He was very nice and helpful with this stuff. And I was asking him leading questions, hoping that he would answer a lot of the questions and deal with a lot of the issues on the record that people bring up about and around him a lot. And I thought it would be really helpful. But what really ended up happening is that it just made me want to ask him a bunch of follow-up questions about this stuff. And also the audio quality was really bad in Frank's video, and so it took me some time to figure out how to correct for all the problems and get it to work, which I did. So the editing of his video was a bit of a chore in itself. And I think because he doesn't make videos very often and he hasn't seen any kind of a positive result come of this video, he probably just feels uncomfortable about it. A lot of people who don't make videos and who aren't in control of their own editing, it makes sense that they would feel uncomfortable about how they'll be presented on camera. So I get that, I get that you'd be a little bit worried about editing and stuff. So my hope today is that I can both share this interview with you, share what Frank Visser has to say, put it out there on the record, and I probably will also still quote it in the What You Talking About Wilbur video where appropriate, but I kind of wanted to share it in full. And also, I'm gonna ask the questions like I would have asked them, like Frank and I are having a conversation, and then after each question, I'll give my thoughts on his answer. And my hope is that maybe in doing this can be something like a part 1, and maybe we can get Frank to reply in some kind of way. Maybe if not in video, maybe if he's still not comfortable with that, I would understand that. But maybe we can get some kind of a written response from him about some of these topics and the conversation can continue on. Or maybe we can get him to come into my Facebook group. If you're not a part of that, you need to join. That's where a lot of the conversation is going down. I do bi-weekly Q&As, and I'm trying to do bi-weekly interviews. So maybe we can get Frank on there and we can continue with some of this dialogue there. But that's why I got to sort of a stopping point with this, is because I really wanted to give him a chance to be able to respond to some of this stuff. And I kept asking him, and he kept on kind of dodging and not really wanting to be on the video. So we'll see where it goes from here. Frank, I hope you're watching, and I hope this inspires you to engage further, brother. Before we kick it off, I want to say that I really appreciate Frank Visser. He has been holding down basically the only critical integral forum for something like 2 decades. Regardless of what you think about Frank, he has been a real service to our community, I think. He has been critical of integral voices, but we need a place for criticism to live. And unfortunately, as I've said in the past, a lot of integral's unaddressed shadow lives on the Integral World webpage. The good criticisms and the bad ones. And so far, the most advanced community, the group that's supposed to be the very best at integrating in multiple perspectives and giving a sympathetic listen and a sympathetic read, being able to process tension skillfully and be able to move forward together in skillful ways. I'm not really seeing this from the integral community as of yet, which is not to say that means it's not possible or that it's a failure, but it does mean that we need to really step it up and live up to our name. But Frank Visser has been taking fire in this community for a long time, and I appreciate all the work that he does. And so I'm super excited to be able to even be making this video right now. And without any further ado, I will bring you Frank Visser, starting with my first question, which is, what is your experience of the integral community?
Hi David. Well, I've been involved with Wilbur since '82. I had contact with him in '95. I met him in '97 twice, and then after the year 2000 we got the Integral Institute. Then it somehow turned into a different direction than I was planning. It became a movement, it attracted younger people, and I see it now as a community who celebrates a certain body of ideas, but not in a very critical way. And that is strange because the claims and the statements made by Wilbur and his students are meant to be scientifically valid, so it's quite obvious that you need to apply rationality to it in every kind of way. So in my website Integral World, I've tried to embody that, and for 20 years now I've posted critical reviews of Wilbur and his ideas on the website, and until this very day it has attracted quite some visitors, and hopefully it is appreciated. But the movement, the Integral movement by itself, has taken another route. And that's fine, because you can apply these ideas in many different ways. But for me, the work I do seems, to me at least, very necessary. Otherwise you grow into an ideology. a body of knowledge that is never questioned or never assessed and evaluated, and has no open exchange of ideas back and forth about the validity of the ideas, is doomed to become an ideology.
So Frank says that he got into these ideas in 1982. I was born in 1982. So he has been doing this a very long time. So big respect to Frank. I mean, it's humbling to think that he's been thinking about these ideas for that long. It sounds like Frank's experience and my experiences are similar in terms of being sold on Wilber's ideas for a while and then thinking about them more critically. But I personally come from a more religious background than Frank does, and I think this is going to show up later, because one of the reasons that I really fell in love with Integral was because it was able to make this pre-trans distinction, and to me that was really important philosophically because it resonated with a really important truth that I'd already learned from Joseph Campbell.
Joseph Campbell, probably the recent era's greatest mythology or interpretive mythology, and somebody I certainly cut my teeth on. I was a great admirer of his and really extraordinary work that he did. He used to very, very vehemently, actually, say that there's really sort of two types of mythology, or mythology forms two different functions. He wouldn't use the terms pre-rational and trans-rational, but the way we're talking about them is the way he would talk about these two functions of mythology. And the first function is when mythology is taken to be concretely real. What some people do, particularly educated, intelligent people like us that are trying to get some meaning in our lives, we can tend to take myths as deeply symbolic of something else. Campbell knew this. So that's a very, very distinguishing way to tell the difference between pre-rational myths that are taken to be concretely, literally true, and trans-rational myths that may represent some very high transpersonal dimensions. So as long as we take both of those into account, then we have this sort of more integral overview. And the problem, again, with the pre-trans fallacy is that people like Freud take every trans-rational as if higher mythology and reduce it to two-year-old infantile nonsense. And way too many people take a lot of the pre-rational stuff and elevate it to trans-rational glory it just doesn't have. You ask them exactly what is it that you're doing. If they're making an empirical claim, check it empirically. On the other hand, it can be a very high kind of metaphoric and as-if interpretive tool or Rorschach block.
Every mythology, every religion is true in this sense. It is true as metaphorical of the human and cosmic mystery. But when it gets stuck to the metaphor, then you're in trouble.
So I agree with you that the integral community is not critical enough. They claim like they're scientifically valid, but when you bring up scientific criticisms, they just call you orange, right? So the idea that Integral World has been going for 20 years. They've been working on these criticisms for 20 years. That's super impressive. I would love to see a meta-analysis of that data. I would also love to see a video history of Integral. That would be super interesting, especially from an outside or a more critical perspective, like maybe a history and integral criticism. That'd be super interesting. And Frank, if you want to make that video, I would be down to help you make it. So hit me up about that. One of the things that I've thought a lot about in terms of my approach to criticism and peer review around a lot of this stuff is that I don't want to just talk trash about an idea. I want to offer up a suggestion about how to make it better. Not just tear things down, but also try to offer things up. I feel like if you're just focused on tearing things down, then you're kind of selling yourself short in terms of how much you could possibly contribute. Like, if you don't think it's that way, then how do you think it is? Or how could we come up with a test to figure out how it could be? These are helpful things. So in my 4 S's of an integral spiritual practice, I talk about not just how Wilber has a simplified view, but I talk about what a more holistic view could actually look like given integral theory. So like I offered up to the community the Davidian integral map. And then I started that subreddit, UpdateAQAL, and I invited the community to offer up their ideas, and we're going to refine the map together. So this is very productive. I think we can make things better. And to me, this is a way of really honoring the people in the past and the contributions of the past, as well as trying to take the ball that they've given us and run forward with it, where I feel like a lot of the critics just want to naysay and talk ish. It's more regressive and less empowered. So I feel like we need to take up more power and responsibility instead of being like, oh, Ken Wilber's wrong, so integral's not that good. We need to be like, Ken Wilber's wrong, and I'm integral, so I need to figure out how we can make it better. I think that's where it's at. On to the next question. What would you like to see the integral movement be or do in the world?
I don't have that much big ideas about how integral should become mainstream, as it is said many times and hoped for by Wilber. But I think the body of ideas is interesting enough to analyze and to evaluate, because 4 decades of energy by Wilber has been put into it, and it has so many different sidelines and domains it touches, from spirituality to science, so there's more than enough to investigate for a whole lifetime. I've therefore selected a couple of areas myself, especially the science areas, like biology, and recently also physics, especially thermodynamics, to see if Wilber in those areas that are not his core business has any kind of validity. It turns out, unfortunately, he has not. So I hope, speaking for this special area only, that Integral will touch bases with science or be at the risk of drifting off into some kind of new age kind of worldview and movement that makes a lot of people happy but shouldn't have claims to any factual validity.
I actually think this is a really good test. We should ask more people this question. What would you ultimately or ideally like to see Integral do or be in the world? This really touches at the heart of an Integral mission statement. Like, what do you think the power of these ideas in the world are, and how can we ultimately use them to help or make things better? When I ask Frank this question, he says that he kind of doesn't believe in the mainstreaming of Integral. Like, he thinks that's where this is going, maybe. And we know through spiral dynamics that most people are not really up to an integral stage of development. Integral is not really something that you want to just talk about to everyone. Integral is not an idea that we need to get everyone to understand or agree with. That's not really skillful. That's some first-tier thinking. So I would agree with him if he's saying that. But in terms of mainstreaming, if we're talking like that we need integral governance, that we need integral structures, integral societies, I think, yes, we do need that kind of mainstreaming. And we don't really hear anything from Frank about making the world better or helping any discipline or anything like that. He talks about how he himself personally is looking forward to evaluating and investigating the theory for himself. So it doesn't sound like he's really connected to the idea of a bigger community or a bigger project or a bigger movement or an integral vision for helping the world. And I kind of find that concerning. Maybe he's just not, because he's been doing this for a long time and he's totally jaded and given up on the ideas that people like Ken Wilber talk about. But these ideas are not just Ken Wilber's ideas. These ideas are ideas that are slowly coming online, that are an idea that as time has come. When Ken Wilber says that these ideas are at an actual stage that he just codified some of, like made like a formula and a little map, and that it really resonates with people at these stages, because it does like ring the bell of a certain kind of perspective, like right in the heart. I feel like real integralists are moved by this stuff, not just in a cognitive way, but in a way like, this could help people. I could use this to help people. This could make life better. These distinctions and discernments really matter. And why are we evaluating and investigating? Are we doing it to refine the map, to make it better, to make the world better? I hope so. I mean, just because he's not saying it doesn't mean that it's not there, but it sounds like he doesn't really even believe in an integral vision. And that's kind of what I'm asking him. Is there some kind of an ideal integral vision in there? Next question. What would you say to people who call you orange?
And then orange means rational in spiral dynamics jargon. Incidentally, I would call that yellow, but that's for later. The question itself is very telling, because rationality is something you cannot afford to miss in a movement and a body of knowledge like this. Because, as I said before, you run the risk of becoming an ideology, an unquestioned and unreflexive worldview, if you don't allow for enough rationality. So, in my view, the culture around Wilber and Integral is in some part intellectual, but it is an intellect that defends or promotes or celebrates the ideas, and not a more sober and skeptical attitude that says, with every claim and statement made by Wilber, hey, is that really true? What do the experts say in a certain field? Can he get away with anything he says and writes? Is that enough authority to believe his ideas? I don't think so. So again, that's especially what a rational person would say and demand, actually.
I think that that is absolutely true, that that's what an orange rational person would say and demand. But I also would want to hear more than that, to hear that you're also a trans-rational person, right? I want to hear some transpersonal distinctions. I want to hear some trans-rational distinctions. I want to hear some cosmocentric or world-centric care. So maybe he just lost track and only said half of what he wanted to say. You know, it's not to say that he can't make these distinctions. He very well could, but he didn't. I only hear him saying what the rational person would say. And he's right. You know, a lot of these integralists really aren't rising up to the rational standard. They have a lot of pre-trans confusion, and some of them commit this pre-trans fallacy number 2. But I think, as we'll see, Frank might have a tendency to commit pre-trans fallacy number 1. But we'll get into that deeper. I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt. I'm not jumping to conclusions. These are more like questions. I want this to hopefully open up a further conversation where Frank can make some of these distinctions on the record. For example, Integral World is free. He does this stuff for free. He puts tons of his own personal time into doing all this work for us, for the community, for free. That's not what an orange materialistic person would do. That's something that you do for the community. That's something that you do out of a deep care. So I want to hear more about this. I want to stop hearing Frank Visser is orange. And that's the motivation behind asking this stuff. It's not like a gotcha kind of a thing. It's like a make these distinctions on the record. Let's be done with these stupid name-calling dismissals like you're orange, because it's not true. And you know what? Even if Frank is orange, even if he's totally orange, even if he's Richard Dawkins, when it comes to the subject of science, when it comes to what's falsifiable, when it comes to what's actually true, science is the authority. Orange methodology and standards are the authority on topics like evolution and whatnot.
What is it that you're doing? If they're making an empirical claim, check it empirically.
Real integralists should know better than trying to reduce any person to a stage. Ideas are at stages. We don't say a person is at a stage. That's some real freshman integral type stuff, and is actually violent. Frank's point is that we should all have healthy orange online, and to say they're orange probably says more about that person and their shadow issues and the things that they need to integrate to really be healthy, which is actually Frank's point. Psychoanalyzing a person instead of dealing with their points is an ad hominem fallacy. It's actually a really interesting hybrid type fallacy. It's actually some kind of an ad hominem red herring straw man combination that integralists use way too often. If you're really mature and you really know what you're talking about, you should be able to explain to people who are less mature. Even if they can't fully yet grasp what you're talking about, you should still be able to explain it. It's not cool to insult a person as opposed to dealing with their ideas reasonably. Frank starts off this comment by talking about orange versus yellow.
Incidentally, I would call that yellow, but that's for later.
Well, I would have liked to hear a distinction in there. Why yellow and not orange? What's the difference? Tell us the difference. Why yellow then? He doesn't get to it, unfortunately. Okay. Next question. What's your idea of spirituality like?
As if there is a kind of opposition between being rational and being spiritual. That's a large field, of course. For me personally, spirituality was very, very important when I was in my 20s, in 30s. I went to India, I studied the psychology of religion. I met Wilber. That's all part of a kind of project I had to understand the mystical dimension. But over the years, it kind of evaporated for me, the whole field. I don't think the world needs any more people who have experienced higher states or have claims about stages and state stages and what have you. I think the world needs rational and humanistic values and common sense. And that would be a great accomplishment if that goal was reached. And Wilber would say exactly the same because he wrote that in Up from Eden in 81. But the attention has gone too much towards the mystical and the exceptional. And this trend has really caused a kind of hubris in many of the integralists who feel they are really taking the next step and the next leap and the next stage of development. And I think that's a very unhealthy situation, to say the least.
Now you see why I really wanted to do some follow-up on this stuff. So Frank actually starts this whole thing out seeming to imply that rationality and spirituality are not mutually exclusive.
As if there is a kind of opposition between being rational and being spiritual.
There's not any opposition between the two. I wish he would have actually explored this point a little bit further. I would like to hear how he thinks that they harmonize. But then he goes on basically to talk about India and mystics and state stages and metaphysical dimensions and all this kind of stuff that basically is woo-woo. And then he says that he lost interest in the whole thing. He said the whole field just kind of dissipated for him. It sounds like when he thinks about spirituality, he thinks about blue and green, outdated, unfounded, bullish, woo-woo. Like, I don't hear him making a transrational distinction. I don't hear him seeing the baby in that dirty bathwater or finding the value in this poetry or this symbolism. He seems to just be dismissing it as all childish people making claims about some grandiose thing or some special experience that they had. And people need to outgrow that and just be rational and come with these humanistic values. This is the whole point. This is what I was saying about the reason that I consider myself an integralist is because we're supposed to be able to make these kind of distinctions where we're able to skillfully harmonize rationality and spirituality in a way that the spirituality is healthy because it harmonizes with the science and it doesn't step on the toes of rationality. I think someone like Michael Dowd is really good at doing this, kind of translating Christian symbolism in a very reasonable, humanistic kind of way.
Now, I personally am rather passionate about what I call the path of factual faith or sacred realism. I'm a religious naturalist. I have no supernatural or otherworldly beliefs. We are in the largest transformation of religious sensibility in perhaps human history, a second axial age. I call it the evidential reformation, where all the religions of the world are coming to realize that there is no future for humanity or for their faith if we don't come into right relationship to reality. I sometimes say reality is my God, evidence is my scripture, and ecology is my theology. And said another way, any understanding of God that doesn't include what we today mean by the word reality isn't God. reality is Lord. That's not a belief, that's a fact. That is, everything submits to and is accountable to what today we would call reality. What's real, whether you believe in it or not. And whether you call that God or the goddess or the universe or cosmos or, whatever, Buddha nature, we are all part of that, what I call divine reality. We have to learn from nature as if nature is the voice of God, and if nature's laws are God's laws, and we either need to abide by those laws or we suffer the consequences. We will create the hell for ourselves and our children. And any understanding of scripture that doesn't include evidence is not God's word. Evidence is the main way reality is revealing truth to us today. Not only the evidence of our own experience, but also scientific, historic, and cross-cultural evidence. So that can't be, that needs to be lifted up at the realm of divine revelation or God's word or scripture.
And I actually think it's totally reasonable to want to take this on as a project and to find ways to make our poetry and our stories better harmonize with rationality and reason. I mean, I think it's the short-term translation kind of an approach. I think ultimately we would want to have a more transformative approach and come up with a newer, better, holistic way of coming up with a really healthy religion. And I have a video about that, about what are the functions of mythology and religion and my ideas about how I think we could get something like that going. But basically, I think we can fix all the problems of religion and still fulfill the functions in a healthy way. In the same way that we haven't had a healthy or a perfect government yet. A government fulfills certain roles and functions, and we need a government. The goal shouldn't ultimately be to get rid of government, but to make a healthy and good government that avoids the pitfalls of the past and solves the problems, fulfilling the functions. So if you haven't seen them before, Frank, I would suggest that you dig into some of my videos about harmonizing spirituality with rationality, because I don't feel like there's really anything objectionable. I honestly don't feel like you and I disagree about anything except for the way that you seem to want to straw man and dismiss spirituality. Like, for example, to me, spirituality could be something like, the way that I approach this conversation is a form of spirituality. It's a type of spiritual practice to get control of my state and get my thoughts together and be able to deliver it skillfully to you in a way that respects you and honors my values and virtues. That's a type of spiritual practice. I think we can hold attitudes towards life and meanings about life that aren't necessarily rooted in any kind of absolute or objective truth. For example, some people get married and they have a magical ceremony and they trade vows and rings and they look at each other and the world and life differently now because now they're married. Is that true? Is it objective? Is it absolute? Is it superstitious? Is it nonsense? Is it childish? I don't think so. I think that there's a lot of ways that we can engage with reality that have to do with created meanings or projected values and intentions with which we go about stuff. Even getting to a point where you're noticing that you're getting upset and taking a deep breath and calming down, getting aware of your state, deciding to move away from the negative friction stuff and into a heart space, and you make some kind of practice of a sympathetic read or Socratic questioning. Like, any of these kinds of meditative practices or mental practices are rightly called spiritual practice, and there's nothing necessarily superstitious about it. In fact, it's very rational. In fact, if you want to be a really skillful, good, practical humanitarian, I mean, even humanitarian values are relative. To some extent, you could say it's a spiritual belief. Humanitarian values and practices. It's a type of religion, depending on how you define religion, how loosely you define it, and also how well you define humanitarianism and flesh that out. I understand not liking the word spiritual, but it's kind of like talking about your heart. We know that the heart is just a blood pump, but at the same time, we talk about a broken heart or our heart goes out to you. We talk about the heart like this in a very poetic kind of way, and I think talking about spirituality and spiritual practice is valid poetry too. When we're talking about the spiritual realm, we're just talking about software. We're talking about interiority. We're talking about feelings and values and meanings and projections and all the kind of interior spiritual type stuff. It doesn't necessarily have to be taken literally as a claim about the truth of reality that there's spirit underlying everything or something like that. This is actually what I would consider to be a pre-trans distinction. If you take spirit literally, that's pre-rational, versus if you take spiritual metaphorically in the way that I'm talking about, that's a more trans-rational understanding of the word spiritual.
Every mythology, every religion is true in this sense. It is true as metaphorical of the human and cosmic mystery. But when it gets stuck to the metaphor, then you're in trouble.
So ultimately where I'm going with this is, I do think that Frank is kind of committing the pre-trans fallacy number one here, which is the fallacy that's often correlated with orange, right? So it makes sense that if you're going around making this kind of a fallacy, you're not seeing the trans-rational poetic side of things. If you don't have a good relationship with the poetry, with the value, and with the meaning, and you can't make a distinction between the superstitious stuff and the healthy and valuable stuff, well, that's a problem. And I'm hoping that I can be the voice of reason in this community, in this debate between these two extreme sides, and be like, hey, hey, hey. Hey, hey, hey! Frank is right. We do need to be more critical, and yeah, these ideas don't really stand up, and we need to look into them deeper, and also be like, but hold on.
Hold on to your butts.
There's value in this poetry, there's value in this symbolism, there's value in spiritual practice. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. This, I feel like, is kind of my role. This is what a lot of my videos are about. So I would definitely advise you to check out some of these videos about the pre-trans fallacy, or about harmonizing rationality and spirituality, my trans-rationality video, semantic compatibilism. Dig into some of my work about this stuff and tell me if I'm wrong. If you think I'm messing it up, tell me how I'm messing it up. Let's have this conversation further. But I think I'm getting it right, and I think if we do a good job with this, there's actually something very practical and very good for humanity here. Because instead of getting caught up in the divisiveness of religion or the superstition of religion, we can see all the world's traditions as poetry and all the world's traditions as our tradition, as belonging to me as a human, instead of like, oh, these are for this group and these are for this group. Now it's all a part of our human story of what it is to be human. All different cultural inflections on what it is to be human. You know, Frank, if you're not familiar with the work of Joseph Campbell, Power of Myth is on Netflix, and you should dig deep into this stuff because it really helped me when I was in a very similar situation to you. And maybe you'll start to see that this isn't just about superstition, that it's about poetry. And poetry is a super important part of being a person. And it's really practical for living well.
When I read these stories, no matter the culture of their origin, I feel first this sense of wonder at the spectacle of the human imagination, simply groping to try to understand this existence. Does that ever happen to you?
I tell you, mythology I think of as the homeland of the muses, the inspirers of art, the inspirers of poetry. And to see life as a poem and yourself participating in a poem is what the myth does for you.
What do you mean a poem?
I mean a vocabulary in the form not of words, but of acts and adventures, which connote something transcendent of the action here, and which yet informs the whole thing. So that you always feel in accord with the universal being. All the gods, all the heavens, all the worlds are within us. They are magnified dreams. And what dreams are manifestations in image form of the energies of the body in conflict with each other. What the myth has to provide, I mean, just on this immediate level of life instruction, the pedagogical aspect of myth, it has to give life models. And the models have to be appropriate to the possibilities of the time in which you're living. And our time has changed and changed and changed and continues to change so fast that what was proper 50 years ago is not proper today. So the virtues of the past are the vices of today. And that's why it's ridiculous to go back to the old-time religion. It belongs to another age, another people, another set of human values, another universe. No one had any idea. The world was a little three-layer cake, and the world consisted of something a few hundred miles around the Near Eastern centers there. No one ever heard of the Aztecs. The world changes, then the religion has to be transformed.
Next question. What are the main areas of criticism on the Integral World webpage?
When the site started around 2000, we had, of course, 9/11, and that really cried out for an integral analysis. And people like Ray Harris and Don Beck offered their essays to make sense of what really happened in this world where cultures and values clashed and the world was on fire. Over the years, the attention went to quadrants, the holons, if this was internally consistent, like conceptual reflections about this part of integral theory. And over the years, we've had many offshoots. Mark Edwards was taking a left turn, Andy Smith was taking a right turn. One increased the number of holons or quadrants, and the other wanted to simplify the model. That was a very fruitful time, unfortunately completely ignored by Wilber and his closer students, as if it was not really relevant to reflect on the core concepts of integral theory. Then we got the issue of Urus, and especially Andrew Cohen, with his quite objectionable behavior towards his students. That was critically followed by David Lane, others, until a couple of years later, Cohen was told to leave by his closer students because of his misbehavior. So there was a really critical and useful public function of Integral World to closely follow a person like Cohen, who was endorsed by Wilber as a rude boy and implicitly got the blessing of the Integral to do whatever he liked. And this is another area of critical inquiry I really value. Then my own writing started around the topic of evolution. That's a large domain, of course, but it is very central to integral theory because Wilber even started to use the label evolutionary for his every activity, where first integral was the label label and the brand, it was now evolutionary. Compare that to the fact that he has actually zero understanding of the basics of evolutionary theory, and the very few things he has written about it are worse than an average creationist would dare to write. So that is a really horrible situation, intellectually speaking. So that is for me a whole field of research that opened. And more recently, I've tried to do the same thing with physics, because Wilber believes in his beloved eros in the cosmos. And that means a force behind the whole trend towards complexity and consciousness. From my side, I see that as begging the question big time, because that way you never have to explain how these things emerge. You just say there's a force behind it that does it. In science, that's a no-brainer. And even in complexity science, nobody would say that has any kind of validity as a cop-out. In fact, there are many interesting ways to explain the emergence of complexity, from the very small to the very large. And in no way do we need to resort to easy so-called explanations like there's a spirit behind it. That is the end of science and the end of rationality.
So yeah, that's interesting that Wilber switched the brand from integral to evolutionary. I guess he thought that would be more marketable and accessible for the general public. Frank is definitely right, though, that this stuff is super embarrassing, and it really has messed up the potential of integral being taken serious in academia or in the world. That's a serious problem. All right, let's get back to it. What do you say to people who think that integral world is not the home of good criticism?
I think that's a very easy dismissal. If a forum has been alive for 20 years and has been for a long time the only forum online to discuss these ideas, what you can expect is a great variety of quality submissions in that forum, but for sure there have been some valid ones expressed, even in a whole book by Jeff Meyerhoff. Bold Ambition has been published on that site. My own articles count, I hope, as well as valid criticisms. So I don't know really what to say about these kinds of responses, because you can use that argument until the cows come home and you're really neck deep into your ideology. But you really need to engage your criticism to avoid that danger.
I definitely agree that it's problematic and disingenuous, and it is just a simple dismissal to act like all of these critics are just disingenuous or mean or childish or whatever. These critics are sincere, and even if they don't really understand, they need to be engaged with. We still need to explain to them and other people who might think like them why they're confused and how to get it right. Just being like, oh, they're bad critics, or oh, they're mean. If you go to the Integral World website and you read these articles and you only think of them as being dismissive and disingenuous, then you're not really being honest. These people have real, valid criticisms. Doesn't mean they're always right, doesn't mean I agree with them all, but I do think that they're sincere and they're not just trying to be mean or trolling. There are those people out there on the internet, but for the most part, what I see at Integral World is sincere, honest criticism. And again, it doesn't mean everyone's right, doesn't mean that people aren't using fallacies, doesn't mean they're not confused, but they should be taken seriously. And doing that is good for everyone. Even if you can't change their mind immediately, a good response to them would be on the record. It could help them learn over time, and it could help other people who are trying to figure this stuff out too. Also, I'm published on Integral World. My Integral Creative Friction with Corey DeVos letter is on there, and you can also check out the audio version of me reading it if you're interested in that. You can check that out right here on YouTube. All of these links are going to be down in the description. Next question. Can you make a brief list of ways that Wilber gets science wrong?
Yeah, basically the areas of biology and physics are relevant here. In biology, Wilber is just a crypto-creationist who has not even done his homework, and he tries to score his points as a politician with soundbites and slogans and ridicule. He has, I think, not even an interest in the field. He doesn't care about how birds fly or the human eye is evolved or species separate. For him, the only point that counts is that he can maintain there's a spirit behind everything, and this spirit can be contacted, and then this is the basis of modern spirituality. For me, that's just a non-relevant approach to the question, where does complexity come from? And there are so many interesting answers out there, no final answers, but interesting and substantial answers that don't beg the question. And that for me, this whole approach is very unfruitful that Wilber has taken, and it shows him as a kind of spiritual ideologist who just wants to promote his idea that there is an eros in the cosmos. The same goes for his dismissal of the famous second law of thermodynamics, which says that in the cosmos, things even out, they balance out, heat and cold, all kinds of gradients flatten in the end. Wilber says in A Theory of Everything, hey, but simple observation tells us that things go from simple to complex, so that's a ridiculous idea, as he would call it later. Things go the opposite way. Well, if you really study that field, you see that both could be true. There's a paradox that even in a universe that burns itself up, stars burn until they have used up all their hydrogen. Complexity under certain specific conditions can arise. And it's especially this paradox that is interesting. Wilber wants nothing about this. He just dismisses the second law and says there's a trend towards complexity, and there's even a spirit behind that. Well, Here again, he's completely out of touch with science. And that's really embarrassing for somebody who has a beta education, and he should know better than that. But the fields are very big, and I'm not claiming to have a very expert knowledge of it, but even as an amateur, I can find so many holes in his writings that it's embarrassing.
I agree. I also find it to be completely embarrassing. And this is part of why I have gone to work trying to make intro videos, not just because Integral tends to keep everything behind a paywall, but because I honestly would rather people learn about integral theory from me than from Wilber, because I'm less likely to confuse them about the nature of reality. It's definitely a major problem, and it has definitely stifled the success of the Integral project in general. I think if we could figure this stuff out and get it right and align ourselves with science, we could actually achieve amazing things in the world. Next question. Why does it matter to you? Why does it concern you?
Yeah, I don't know. I have a deep connection with Wilber and his project. I've followed it since '82 for 3.5 decades. And in the beginning, for 2 decades, I was really a Wilberian, if ever there was one, until I started investigating the fields he touches, especially the scientific ones. I got second thoughts and doubts about the validity of his claims. The fact that he could write beautifully and persuasively is, of course, the reason I believed it for so long. But now that I'm older and wiser, I investigate these things for myself, and I find many things that are questionable in what he writes.
I think you're right. I definitely think he should know better. I definitely think it's an embarrassment. I definitely think it ends up selling out his project and his community, but he's also the first word on the topic, and maybe he also is really trying to do good and trying to maintain what he thinks is best. And so, even though I disagree with him and I think he should know better, I think there's major issues with what he does. I think we can stand on his shoulders and make it better and refine a lot of the stuff that he's brought to the table and do good things with it. But this is another place where it's kind of a chance for Frank to talk about why he cares. And he doesn't say, because these ideas can make a big difference in the world or because they matter. It almost sounds like a sunk cost fallacy, right? Where he's like, well, I've been doing this for a long time, so I'm interested to see where it goes. And I get that, and maybe that's fine, especially if you don't have a lot of faith in it at this point. But for me, I care about where it goes, and I want to help get us there. I want to do some good stuff with this. And so if you make some kind of response to this and you do have some kind of a passion for an integral vision, that's going to be one of the things that I'd really like to hear about from you, Frank. Frankly, next question. How do we move integral further? What do you see as the future of integral?
I think the integral movement will run its course. It will grow perhaps a little bit in volume. It will have its conferences and festivals, and both in the US and in Europe, in Hungary. But then it will, I think, just die out, because Wilber, of course, is not the youngest anymore and the healthiest. And when he passes away, I think there are not enough people with the intellectual capacity to bring this forward. You could compare it with psychoanalysis. We had Freud, who tried to own every expression and idea in that field in a very authoritarian way, and Wilber is probably comparable to that. But we don't have a Jung or an Adler in that field of integral at the moment to even try a different school or bring these ideas further. So I'm not too optimistic about that, but anyway, it doesn't matter. For the moment, we have enough to investigate and to analyze.
Thank you so much, Frank, for your time and the footage, and I really hope that we can continue this conversation further. I do have to disagree with you, though, because I know this young guy who is real excited and passionate about this stuff. He started the integral emergentist revolutionary movement directly in opposition to what Wilber is doing with a lot of the spiritual stuff, right? The emergentist brand versus an idealistic brand, and also in opposition to what Wilber is doing with all of these translations all the time. This is the revolutionary movement with a small r, emphasis on the E, and this evolutionary in revolutionary is actually in line with science and emergentism. So there is a person out there who's advocating for not only a healthy version of an integral movement, and I hear he's working on a handbook for how to get this stuff started, and he wants to have a web page to bring the integral movement together that's not behind a paywall. So things like this, these are some pretty huge things when they come together. That's going to be a big deal for the community. He also put out his own Davidian map and then gave it away to the community and then started a subreddit where we could work on refining the map together. These are pretty big revolutionary changes within the integral community in the integral movement. I mean, it's still kind of getting up and going, but there's already some exciting things happening and it's still early. So maybe you're speaking a little bit too soon about the future of integral and what's possible. Maybe you didn't realize that because of all the value that you've brought with your integral world stuff, that the young next generation who's up and coming might see both the value of the integral project as well as the integral criticisms and synthesize these things to create the integral movement 2.0. But of course, that seems like the inevitable synthesis. I would actually encourage you to get on board and get excited and quit with this jaded-ish and get passionate about an integral vision and what we can do for the world, because that's where your head and heart should be at, my brother. And I hope that we can bring some new excitement to this field and really start to process these tensions. The great thing about what this leader in particular is doing is that he doesn't think he has the answers to everything, and he wants to actually use integral processes and standards and bring that to bear on what the whole integral community has to say over time. So these are some major differences. These are some major upgrades. By the way, I'm talking about myself if you don't know. Go watch my videos. Check out the Davidian versus Wilberian stuff. Check out my criticisms of Wilber. Check out my videos about transrationality and harmonizing spirituality. This is exciting, cutting edge stuff. Even this conversation is exciting and cutting edge. These people have been not talking and lying dormant for so long, and where you just get so stuck in these talking points. Frank Visser's orange, oh, Ken Wilber. The whole conversation is stagnant. Let's shake it up. Let's get some nuance in there. Let's actually take a sympathetic view to both sides and figure out together what the best synthesis integral 2.0 is. That's what's up. If you feel me, smash like. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe to that thing. Ring that bell. You're gonna want to get involved in this stuff. Check out some of these videos that I got about this stuff. Support me on Patreon because I could definitely use the support. I hope y'all have a wonderful day. Frank, hit me up, man. Peace.